alone. Hi everyone, welcome to Vimmunity, a virtual concert series from Ensemble Vim to our community. Each episode of this concert is hosted by a member of the ensemble. We are going to present some beautiful music while we support some local nonprofit organizations who are doing extremely important things for our community, especially during this time. Today, I'll be talking with composer Jennifer Jolley and discussing her piece, You Are Not Alone, written in 2019 in response to the Me Too movement. Ensemble Vin was scheduled to perform this piece in our spring concert, which is postponed unfortunately because of the pandemic. We'll hopefully reschedule and perform this piece when our season resumes. We'll be also talking to Barbara Gibson, the Safehouse Director from the Women's Resources Center to End Domestic Violence in Decatur, Georgia, about the works that they do and support survivors of domestic violence. We'll start with Jennifer. Jennifer and I met in 2007 when we went to school together. I was a conducting student at the College Conservatory of Music, we call it CCM. That's where Brian, our last week's guest, went to school as well. Jennifer was doing her doctoral in composition at the time, and I've worked with her since in various capacities from band literature to opera, and this was going to be my first time working on her chamber pieces. I was so excited about this opportunity. Jennifer, can we start by having you talk a little bit about the background of this piece and your collaboration with the poet Scott Wood?
So the genesis of this piece came out when the Johnstone Fund for New Music, known as Jack and Zoe Johnstone, they're based in Columbus, Ohio, wanted to do this project where a composer worked with a local poet. And at the time, I was living outside of Columbus, very much a part of the Columbus scene. And because Zoe wanted to put this together, who is a brilliant producer, I'm like, yes, I'm all in. And she paired me up with the poet Scott Woods. And I remember the first time we met, I'd been aware of Scott's work for a very long time, and he's been familiar with mine. I think Zoe was like, you both do social justice-y things. Let's get together. I want you to work together. I don't know how yet. And so she put us together as part of this project. I believe there are 6 composers and 6 poets. And we're going to work together. And at the time, we met at the bar next to the Short North Garden Stage, and there was pie there. I remember that. And at the time we were meeting, we were like, oh my goodness, we respect your work so much. And he's like, well, what do you want to work on? And at first I didn't quite know, because sometimes I just let the poet kind of figure it out. That's kind of how I roll. But after thinking about it, I was thinking of the Me Too movement, and I was thinking about how I was affected by the Judge Kavanaugh hearing, specifically with Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, and I also do remember at the time when the hearings were going on, I didn't want to listen because I was actually trying to protect myself. It reminded me of a time, or actually multiple times, where as a woman, sometimes I will say things and I'm just not heard, or I'm purposely ignored, or like I will mention something in a meeting and someone will repeat literally what I just said. Now the hearings were obviously to an extreme, and fortunately I haven't had any experience with sexual violence. However, I've had many friends who have. And so anyway, I mentioned this to Scott, who's an African-American male. And he's like, you know what, this is your idea, let's do it. And as a poet, he's like, you know what, since this is a sensitive subject, you let me know if anything in the text or the libretto doesn't sound right to you. Because I want to obviously he was going to create words for this project and for this topic, but and he didn't want to seem like he as a male figure had anything to do with like putting a voice into mine, which I thought was interesting because first of all, that was extremely respectful. But second of all, I think as a composer, I'm like, this is always going to be my voice. So
You have proven you have no idea what no means.
So let us discuss yes.
And I'd have to say that the instrumentation that was given to me fit within the Columbus, Ohio Discovery Ensemble, or CODE, as they're known. But also, I decided to make this a joint commission, not just with the Johnstone Fund for New Music, but also with the Women's Composer Festival of Hartford. And at the time, they had the Novo Classical Project, who is their ensemble in residence, which is a Pierrot ensemble minus voice and obviously minus percussion. So it was a quintet, and they're an all-women ensemble. And I thought that since I was going to be the composer in residence for the Women's Composers Festival of Hartford, that might as well blend the two, and it seemed socially relevant, and it seemed to work out okay. I asked the Johnstones just in case, so he's like, oh yeah, awesome. I'm glad you got another commission for this. So I got started on this project, admittedly a little bit later than maybe I should have, but I just moved from Ohio to Texas. So I had a big move, and Zoe still wanted me to be a part of this project, which was very generous of her. You know, like Scott came up with the words, which were great. There was a lot of text though, and it's one thing I've learned with working with like words and text, and I also wasn't working with singers. I knew that the words would have to be spoken. So that being said, knowing that I would be working with an all-women ensemble in Hartford, I was like, why not have them speak? And kind of like tell their story. So it's like they're not only emitting the emotion through my music and their instruments, but also I wanted to hear their voices too. And so therefore, that's why in the piece I had the ensemble members speak their part. So for the premiere in Hartford, I ended up being mic'd for some of it. So that is the genesis of the piece.
We'll be also talking to Barbara Gibson, the Safehouse Director from the Women's Resources Center to End Domestic Violence in Decatur, Georgia.
So the Women's Resource Center has been around since 1986, and we provide services for survivors of domestic violence that includes adults as well as children. And those services are many of the things that you would expect, including emergency shelter, legal advocacy, a 24-hour crisis line. We offer support groups, but we also offer some things that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect, like Camp Peace. It's our peace education program for children who have been impacted by domestic violence. And we work with the children on things like managing big, uncomfortable feelings, really to help them figure out how they can improve their relationships with themselves and also with others. And so we do that through things like meditation, through yoga, through the community resiliency model and the Alternatives to Violence program. And we also have after school activities for the children. The idea really is about creating healthy relationships with yourself and healthy relationships with others understanding that we are all interdependent and how we relate to each other and ourselves is really important for ending domestic violence. We also, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So we also have a pretty big emphasis on self care with the adults that we serve. And meditation and yoga are really big pieces of that. And so, opportunities really to understand what's happening with your interior experience moment by moment. Recognizing when anxiety or frustration rises and recognizing when it shifts or falls or fades. Because when people don't practice mindfulness, what can happen is it can feel like when you're having a difficult time, that difficulty is constant and unchanging. And that contributes, I think, greatly to feelings of frustration and stress and overwhelm. What we really want survivors to be able to do is figure out how they can support themselves as they're moving through the crisis of domestic violence, as they're working through their healing. And so we have a number of groups at the house. We provide shelter for up to 90 days and sometimes even longer if people have certain circumstances that they're dealing with. We can work with families who are not documented or families who have special challenges. We work to provide individualized or targeted services so that the emphasis really is on people over programs, meeting people's unique needs.
Let us peel back that moment when you said what you said and did what you did. Take the onions skin down to rind, down to tear and salsa, umami, the braised meat.
You say that they are in the shelter for up to 90 days. Then can you talk about a little bit about the process, like who will be admitted into the shelter? Would everyone who called or like they're referred to your program be entered into the shelter? And then after the 90 days, where do they go if they don't have a way to support themselves or their families? Are there other like middle places where they can still get support?
Sure. So the Safe House itself has 10 bedrooms, and we can accommodate 32 individuals at one time. And we work with the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department to provide transportation to the house. And families are admitted via our crisis line, which runs 24 hours a day. And so when space is not available, we work with other community agencies to provide referrals to those programs. We also provide transportation assistance. So if a survivor has friends or family in another state or another part of the country, then we can provide assistance with gas or bus tickets to help them get there. And then we also provide assistance. We partner with a couple of hotels locally, and we can assist with hotel stays if the program is full. And then after people leave us, it's not ideal. These are very challenging times, and housing is quite unaffordable, and so not everyone is able to come into the Safe House, find work, save up money, and move into their own apartment. Especially now, it's difficult to find employment with the pandemic, and housing costs are skyrocketing. So we're working with other agencies to provide transitional housing, and we're also working with the housing authority to see what options they have available for housing that is based on people's income. And then we're also encouraging people to co-house so that they can share the expense of transitioning from the safe house into places of their own.
You are not alone, and are utterly alone at once, and twice. Someone told you you were beautiful and should smile more, and it was a sermon like a branding iron on your cheek.
as you mentioned, during the pandemic, a lot of things changed that I imagine the shelter is not as open for health and sanitary reasons. And like, as you said, housing is difficult to find. I would imagine that fewer people are staying in hotels that it would open their doors, but it's probably not the case. So would you mind talking about how the community, how the public can help the program during this very difficult time?
Yeah. So there are a couple of ways. We are just trying to be really creative about how we can help people move out of places where they are afraid into places where they can be safe and begin to work on a plan so that they can move towards stability. So, of course, financial support is always really helpful because we are providing more assistance with hotels. Um, we are trying to work on social distancing in the safe house, and we're trying to balance the needs of the survivors that we're currently working with the needs of people who are fleeing domestic violence. And so that means that we are not operating at capacity because we're doing things like not sharing rooms so that people can have their own space for social distancing. And so we are relying more on hotels. We are, again, also relying more on transportation assistance so that families can go to other, if you can go to another family member in another part of the country or state. And then because we don't want that to be a burden on the family that's receiving the family that's fleeing domestic violence, we are providing some assistance with utilities because the utility expense likely will go up as more people are in the household. And we're also providing some assistance with food. So financial assistance is always really welcome and needed. And I think it's really important to keep the conversations going. We don't talk enough about the problem of domestic violence. We imagine that it only happens to certain kinds of people or only in certain circumstances. But what people need to be aware of is that domestic violence impacts everyone, even if it doesn't impact you in your individual home. And so we want to keep the conversation about domestic violence going. We want to let survivors know that if they are dealing with domestic violence, that they are not alone, that it's not their fault. We also want people who use violence to know that there are other ways. There are people that they can reach out to. For example, Men Stopping Violence is doing some really wonderful work with batterers right now, offering support, offering opportunities to kind of talk about the things that they're experiencing. And we really need to be hopeful about what's possible going forward. Domestic violence is always a choice, and we know that it's culturally supported, and we know that we can do the work in terms of the way that we relate to each other. We can do the work of changing domestic violence. We can uproot some of the causes. We can think about things like patriarchy, misogyny. We can think about equality, and we can really do some fundamental changes in the way that we are to uproot the causes of domestic violence and the impacts of it as well.
Thank you so much for joining me in this week's Vimmunity concert. I hope you enjoy learning more about Jennifer's piece, as well as Barbara and her staff's important work. As she pointed out, a lot of the women in need are not able to reach out for help during this time because of the lack of privacy or even distance from the people causing them harm. So if you know or suspect that anyone you know is in need of help, their hotline is 24/7 available. Also, if you're able, please consider making a small donation to their organization so they can continue doing what they've been doing in helping more survivors. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you at the next Vim concert when we are able to gather together safely and healthily. Thank you.